December 7, 1944, in the frozen forests and flooded valleys of Western Europe. On that day, Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood over maps marked with 3 natural barriers that German planners believed would slow any pursuit: the Saar River, the Kyll River, and the Moselle tributaries, all swollen by rain and snowmelt, all positioned to fracture momentum and buy time for German reorganization. Patton saw them differently, not as obstacles but as opportunities, because World War II had taught him that hesitation at natural barriers allowed defeated armies to recover, dig in, and turn retreat into resistance. The German High Command expected the rivers to impose a pause, assuming Allied units would need days, even weeks, to regroup, bring up bridging equipment, and coordinate crossings under winter conditions that favored defense. Patton's Third Army had no intention of pausing. The operational context mattered. By early December, German forces in the West were exhausted, under strength, and short on fuel, yet still dangerous when given time. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that battered armies could recover if allowed space and time to do so. Patton's philosophy rejected that space entirely. The Third Army's rapid advance across France earlier in the fall had already shocked German commanders, but now terrain itself seemed to promise relief. Rivers froze movement, constrained armor, and forced predictable crossing points. Patton understood that predictability killed momentum. Rather than mass forces at a single crossing, he ordered dispersed, overlapping assaults across multiple river lines, exploiting confusion rather than brute concentration, an approach shaped by lessons learned earlier in World War II when narrow thrusts stalled under counterattack. Engineers were pushed forward alongside lead infantry, not behind them, collapsing the traditional sequence of advance and support. Bridging units moved under fire, often improvising crossings from damaged equipment and local materials. At the Saar River, German defenses were thin but determined, relying on the river's width and current rather than manpower. Patton ordered infantry across immediately, even without armor support, accepting risk to preserve tempo. World War II rewarded tempo disproportionately. Small assault boats crossed under fire, securing narrow footholds before German units fully realized a crossing was underway. By the time defensive fire intensified, bridgeheads already existed, forcing Germans to respond reactively rather than preemptively. Within hours, makeshift bridges followed, not for heavy armor initially, but for trucks, artillery, and fuel, because Patton prioritized sustaining the crossing over showcasing armored breakthroughs. German after-action reports later noted confusion at command level, with multiple alerts triggered simultaneously across different river sectors, fragmenting response capability. The Kyll River followed rapidly. German units expected the river line to halt the Americans long enough to re-establish cohesion. Instead, Patton's lead elements reached it before German rearguards were fully deployed. World War II showed that speed could turn geography into liability. Patton ordered immediate night crossings, exploiting poor visibility to neutralize German defensive fire. Infantry moved silently, guided by local civilians and reconnaissance patrols who identified shallow fords and damaged bridges. German units encountered American forces on their side of the river before they had fully oriented themselves, collapsing defensive planning into localized skirmishes rather than organized resistance. The Third River Line, formed by tributaries feeding into the Moselle, represented the psychological breaking point. German command assumed that even if the first 2 lines were breached, the cumulative effect would slow the Americans. Instead, Patton accelerated. Artillery crossed almost continuously, leapfrogging batteries forward to maintain pressure. World War II logistics doctrine emphasized build-up before movement. Patton inverted it, moving first and sustaining later. Fuel shortages plagued the Third Army constantly, yet Patton gambled that speed itself would compensate, seizing German supplies faster than his own lines could deliver them. German units retreating across the rivers found crossings already compromised, bridges destroyed too late, roads blocked by refugee columns, and American patrols appearing unpredictably along flanks. The result was not a clean breakthrough, but a cascading collapse, where isolated units withdrew independently, severing communication and eroding command authority. World War II demonstrated that front lines often broke not from overwhelming force, but from accumulated disorder. German divisional commanders reported losing contact with adjacent units within hours, creating gaps that widened faster than reserves could fill them. Patton exploited those gaps relentlessly, ordering continuous reconnaissance ahead of main columns, ensuring no pause existed where resistance could consolidate. The psychological effect was decisive. German soldiers, already fatigued, interpreted the crossings as evidence that no defensive line could hold, undermining morale more effectively than bombardment. Patton's command style amplified this effect. He demanded constant forward motion, issuing orders that emphasized direction rather than distance, forcing subordinate commanders to think dynamically rather than defensively. World War II command culture often punished deviation. Patton rewarded initiative if it sustained momentum. German officers later acknowledged that the speed of the crossings denied them the opportunity to establish coherent fallback positions. Defensive plans assumed time that never materialized. Weather compounded the chaos. Snow and rain slowed German movement more than American because Patton's units moved immediately before roads deteriorated fully, while German columns reacted too late. The crossings also demonstrated the maturity of American combined arms coordination by late World War II. Infantry, engineers, armor, and artillery operated in near-constant contact, reducing friction at critical moments. German doctrine emphasized counterattack after penetration, but the multiplicity of river crossings diluted their ability to mass forces effectively. Each river crossed removed another layer of confidence from the German defense, not because rivers were weak obstacles, but because Patton refused to treat them as pauses. World War II often rewarded commanders who redefined obstacles as triggers for action rather than reasons for delay. The speed of the advance created logistical strain on the Third Army, yet German logistical collapse was far worse. Depots fell intact, vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel, and retreat routes clogged with mixed units. Patton's gamble depended on asymmetry. His supply problems were temporary, German disintegration was cumulative. German frontline soldiers increasingly surrendered in small groups, not from fear alone, but from disorientation, unable to identify where their lines now existed. The crossings forced German command to reassess the entire sector, diverting attention and resources from other areas, weakening overall defensive coherence. World War II battles were rarely isolated. Success in one sector reshaped conditions elsewhere. Patton's actions also influenced Allied command decisions. The unexpected pace forced Eisenhower's headquarters to adapt, accelerating plans to exploit openings rather than stabilize lines. Critics later argued that Patton risked overextension, a valid concern in World War II operations, but at that moment, German incapacity to counterattack effectively mitigated the risk. The crossings occurred within a narrow window where German strength was insufficient to punish audacity. Patton recognized that window and acted without hesitation. German post-war analyses identified this episode as a turning point where the illusion of stable defensive geography collapsed entirely. Rivers no longer represented pauses, only delays measured in hours rather than days. Patton's insistence on relentless pressure denied German forces the psychological recovery essential to defense, demonstrating how morale and tempo interacted in World War II. The event reinforced Patton's reputation among both allies and enemies as a commander who weaponized speed, not recklessness, but calculated urgency. German officers noted that Patton's unpredictability forced defensive planning to become reactive rather than proactive, a fatal disadvantage in a war already tilting against them. The crossings also highlighted the role of junior leadership. Company and platoon commanders made independent decisions under fire, adapting crossings without waiting for detailed orders. World War II increasingly relied on such decentralized execution as operations expanded in scale. Patton's leadership created conditions where such initiative was expected rather than exceptional. The German front did not collapse instantly, but its coherence dissolved. Units fell back unevenly, exposing flanks, abandoning equipment, and losing confidence in higher command. Within 48 hours, 3 river lines meant to stabilize the front had failed to do so, not because they were weak, but because Patton refused to grant them strategic significance. World War II repeatedly showed that terrain mattered only insofar as commanders allowed it to matter. The episode became a case study in operational art, illustrating how momentum could outweigh textbook caution when enemy resilience was already eroded. German generals later ranked this sequence among the most disruptive Allied actions of late 1944, not for its scale, but for its psychological effect. Patton's approach underscored a broader truth of World War II. Decisive moments often occurred between major battles, during pursuit, exploitation, and refusal to pause. The crossings fed directly into subsequent operations, shaping the battlefield environment German forces would face during the coming winter battles. By the time German High Command attempted to restore coherence, the opportunity had passed, and the front had transformed from a defensive line into a series of disconnected retreats. Patton's actions during those 48 hours demonstrated how World War II rewarded commanders who understood that collapse often preceded defeat, and that collapse could be accelerated by denying the enemy time to breathe. The rivers flowed on, unchanged, but the assumptions attached to them did not, marking a moment when geography lost its authority over events, and momentum became the dominant force shaping the battlefield. The consequences of that loss of authority rippled outward across the German command structure, forcing emergency conferences and fragmented orders that struggled to catch up with events already unfolding. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that when command lagged behind reality, control slipped irreversibly. German Corps headquarters attempted to reconstitute defensive lines farther east, but the pace of Patton's advance meant that planned positions existed only on maps. Units assigned to occupy them arrived late, depleted, or not at all. World War II exposed the vulnerability of plans that depended on ideal timing. Patton's insistence on crossing immediately also denied German forces the opportunity to mine riverbanks thoroughly or establish coordinated fields of fire. Defensive preparations that required hours instead of minutes became irrelevant. World War II rewarded commanders who compressed the enemy's decision cycle beyond usability. The weather, often cited as a defensive ally, worked against the Germans in this instance. Flooded fields slowed retreating columns more than advancing ones. Patton's troops crossed first, while conditions were marginally passable, leaving Germans to navigate worsening terrain. World War II showed how timing could invert environmental advantage. German artillery units, repositioning to cover river crossings, were frequently caught in transit. American reconnaissance identified movement quickly, allowing counter-battery fire to disrupt redeployment. World War II increasingly favored forces with superior reconnaissance integration. Patton's use of cavalry reconnaissance groups proved decisive. Light, fast-moving elements pushed ahead, probing crossings before resistance solidified. World War II saw a revival of reconnaissance as an active combat arm rather than a passive observer. The rapid crossings also placed stress on American command and control. Communications lagged behind movement, and units sometimes advanced beyond reliable radio contact. Patton accepted this friction, prioritizing momentum over perfect coordination. World War II leaders often faced this trade-off. German officers later reflected that the psychological shock mattered more than the physical crossings themselves. Rivers symbolized safety, their loss suggested inevitability. World War II combat morale depended heavily on such symbols. Patton's ability to maintain pressure across multiple river lines prevented German units from learning or adapting. Each failed stand erased lessons that might have informed the next. World War II adaptation required time, which Patton refused to grant. American engineers played a crucial but understated role. Working under fire, often at night, they restored bridges or assembled pontoons faster than German intelligence anticipated. World War II operational success increasingly hinged on technical competence as much as combat skill. The crossings also strained Patton's relationship with higher Allied command. Reports describing rapid movement across major obstacles triggered concern about overextension. World War II coalition warfare often required balancing audacity with reassurance. Yet Eisenhower's headquarters recognized that the German response capacity in that sector was collapsing faster than anticipated. Orders shifted from restraint to exploitation. World War II command decisions evolved continuously under pressure. German field reports reveal frustration with conflicting instructions. Some units were ordered to hold river lines at all costs. Others were told to preserve combat power by withdrawing. World War II exposed the paralysis created by ambiguous directives. As German command attempted to stabilize, the front had already transformed. Instead of linear defense, they faced fluid penetrations that defied conventional containment. World War II increasingly resembled maneuver warfare rather than positional stalemate. Patton's emphasis on relentless pursuit prevented the Germans from converting retreat into defense. Vehicles were abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because there was no time to recover or repair them. World War II logistics punished delay ruthlessly. The rapid crossings also influenced American morale. Soldiers sensed that the enemy was no longer dictating tempo. World War II combat effectiveness was deeply tied to perception of momentum. German prisoner interrogations from the period reveal widespread confusion about where the front line actually lay. World War II battles often collapsed not from destruction, but from loss of situational awareness. Patton's actions during this window also affected German strategic calculations beyond the immediate sector. Resources earmarked for other fronts were redirected to stem the advance, weakening overall defensive coherence. World War II interconnected theaters magnified such effects. The episode reinforced Patton's reputation among German officers as a commander who exploited hesitation instantly. His presence forced them to assume worst-case scenarios, accelerating defensive collapse. World War II adversaries learned to fear tempo as much as firepower. American units, advancing across rivers without pause, developed confidence in their own adaptability. Improvisation became routine rather than exceptional. World War II rewarded forces comfortable with uncertainty. The crossings also revealed the limits of static defensive thinking. Rivers could delay, but only if integrated into a coherent system. World War II demonstrated that isolated obstacles offered false security. German efforts to re-establish command cohesion were further undermined by Allied air superiority. Movement by day invited attack. Movement by night risked disorganization. World War II increasingly constrained enemy choice. Patton's refusal to treat rivers as decisive boundaries exemplified a broader shift in Allied operational thinking by late 1944. The war had evolved beyond cautious advances. World War II was entering its final, accelerated phase. The German front's fragmentation after the crossings set conditions that would influence later winter battles. Units entered those fights already weakened, disorganized, and psychologically shaken. World War II cumulative effects rarely reset. Patton's leadership during this period became a reference point in post-war military education. The sequence illustrated how speed, initiative, and calculated risk could overwhelm theoretically strong positions. World War II provided abundant data for such analysis. The rivers themselves faded from maps as defensive lines, replaced by new assumptions about vulnerability. Geography no longer guaranteed respite. World War II showed that certainty was often the first casualty of momentum. In the aftermath, German commanders acknowledged that the failure was not merely tactical, it was conceptual. They had relied on obstacles to compensate for diminishing strength. World War II punished such substitution harshly. Patton's exploitation of those 48 hours reinforced a principle that resonated beyond the campaign. In modern war, opportunity decays rapidly, and commanders who act first often decide outcomes before opponents can respond. The front did not break because the rivers were crossed. It broke because the crossings denied the German army the time needed to recover coherence. World War II, in this sense, rewarded not just movement, but the refusal to pause long enough for the enemy to regain balance. The momentum generated during those hours carried forward into subsequent operations, shaping the tempo of the campaign as Allied forces pressed deeper into German territory, with the psychological imprint of those crossings lingering long after the rivers themselves were behind them. The German attempt to regain balance after the river crossings revealed how deeply the disruption had penetrated command structures. Orders issued at army level often arrived at divisional headquarters already obsolete, reflecting a gap between intent and reality that World War II repeatedly exposed under conditions of rapid movement. Field commanders struggled to interpret contradictory guidance while under constant pressure from advancing American patrols. In World War II, clarity of command was often as decisive as numerical strength, and its absence accelerated collapse. Patton's operations staff exploited this confusion by issuing flexible directives rather than rigid objectives. Subordinate commanders were encouraged to pursue opportunities as they appeared, a method that thrived in the uncertainty of World War II maneuver warfare. German rear area security units found themselves abruptly engaged in frontline combat, further eroding defensive coherence. World War II blurred traditional distinctions between front and rear as mobility increased. The speed of the advance also disrupted German intelligence assessment. Reports lagged behind events, producing an inaccurate picture of American intentions. World War II intelligence failures often stemmed from tempo rather than deception alone. American logistics units adapted rapidly, establishing forward supply points close behind advancing elements. World War II logistics proved capable of elasticity when empowered by aggressive command intent. Patton's decision to push without pause forced German units to abandon prepared positions in favor of improvised defenses. World War II demonstrated that improvised defenses rarely matched the effectiveness of deliberate ones. The river crossings also influenced Allied perceptions of German capability. Confidence grew that the enemy's capacity for coordinated resistance was eroding. World War II morale on the Allied side rose accordingly. German officers later reflected that once momentum shifted decisively, no single countermeasure could restore stability. World War II collapse often unfolded incrementally rather than catastrophically. Patton's emphasis on continuous pressure denied German forces the psychological reset that often followed withdrawal. World War II combat endurance depended on moments of respite that never arrived. American reconnaissance units reported increasing numbers of abandoned vehicles and depots, tangible evidence of disintegration rather than defeat in battle. World War II material losses frequently reflected organizational failure. The crossings also highlighted the cumulative impact of earlier campaigns. German units faced Patton not as fresh formations, but as survivors of prolonged attrition. World War II punished exhaustion as severely as tactical error. Patton's operational success rested partly on understanding this cumulative fatigue. He recognized that enemy weakness was systemic rather than localized. World War II strategy often hinged on identifying such moments. German attempts to stabilize using reserve units failed because those reserves lacked cohesion and transport. World War II reserves, without mobility, could not function effectively. The rapid pace also strained American units physically, but morale remained high due to visible success. World War II illustrated how victory could temporarily offset exhaustion. Patton's leadership style demanded adaptability at every level. Orders emphasized intent rather than procedure, encouraging initiative consistent with World War II's evolving doctrine. German defensive planning, by contrast, remained tied to geographic lines rather than operational flexibility. World War II revealed the vulnerability of such planning under sustained pressure. The crossings also reshaped civilian experience in the region. Populations accustomed to static fronts now encountered sudden shifts in control. World War II civilian life often mirrored military volatility. German communications infrastructure suffered from both Allied interdiction and hurried withdrawals. World War II demonstrated how communication breakdowns could accelerate defeat even without decisive battles. Patton's operations exploited these breakdowns, advancing into areas where German command authority had evaporated. World War II victory often followed the erosion of control rather than direct confrontation. The episode reinforced the principle that speed could serve as a form of protection. By advancing rapidly, Patton reduced the effectiveness of German fire planning. World War II showed that mobility could substitute for armor in certain contexts. German commanders later acknowledged that they underestimated American willingness to operate under logistical risk. World War II revealed contrasting risk tolerances between armies. Patton's calculated acceptance of risk contrasted with German caution born of dwindling resources. World War II punished caution when time favored the attacker. The crossings also affected German strategic planning beyond the immediate sector, complicating preparations for subsequent operations. World War II interconnected tactical events with strategic consequences. American units emerging from the crossings developed a sense of inevitability, believing the enemy could no longer dictate outcomes. World War II morale shifts often preceded physical victory. The German front's unraveling demonstrated that defense relied on cohesion as much as terrain. World War II showed that once cohesion failed, obstacles lost meaning. Patton's actions during those hours became embedded in post-war analysis as an example of exploiting transient advantage. World War II rewarded commanders who recognized and acted upon such moments. The rivers that once anchored defensive plans now served only as geographic features, stripped of their strategic power. World War II repeatedly transformed landscapes into symbols of outdated assumptions. The series of crossings ultimately underscored how modern warfare punished delay. By refusing to pause, Patton compressed German decision-making beyond recovery. World War II, at its core, often turned on the race between action and reaction. The momentum generated in that narrow window extended forward, shaping subsequent engagements and reinforcing a pattern of relentless pursuit that defined Patton's approach in the closing months of the campaign. The German front did not merely bend under pressure. It lost its internal structure, confirming that in World War II, The collapse of order often preceded the collapse of resistance itself. The aftermath of the river crossings forced German higher headquarters to confront the inadequacy of traditional defensive metrics. Map lines, unit boundaries, and projected timetables no longer reflected battlefield reality, a disconnect that World War II repeatedly exposed when tempo outpaced planning. German staff officers attempted to reconstruct situational awareness using fragmentary reports, but rapid American movement rendered these efforts obsolete almost as soon as they were compiled. World War II emphasized that information, when delayed, could be more misleading than none at all. Patton's Third Army benefited from a command climate that accepted imperfect information in exchange for action. Decisions were made with incomplete data, prioritizing momentum over certainty. World War II commanders increasingly recognized this trade-off as unavoidable. The speed of the advance also limited German opportunities for deliberate counterattack. Counterattacks launched piecemeal failed to achieve mass or surprise. World War II punished isolated efforts unsupported by cohesive planning. Patton's exploitation of disarray extended beyond frontline units. Rear-area depots, transportation hubs, and communication nodes fell into American hands before evacuation could occur. World War II demonstrated how operational success cascaded into logistical collapse. German units attempting to regroup found themselves short of fuel, ammunition, and clear orders. World War II exposed how material shortages compounded organizational stress. The crossings also influenced Allied assessments of German morale. Reports indicated increasing resignation among German troops, a shift from earlier periods of determined resistance. World War II morale was dynamic, shaped by cumulative experience. Patton's insistence on continuous forward pressure deprived German forces of the psychological space needed to reframe setbacks. World War II showed that morale recovery required pauses that never came. American artillery units adjusted fire plans rapidly, supporting movement rather than fixed objectives. World War II artillery doctrine evolved toward flexibility, mirroring maneuver priorities. German defensive fires, planned around expected crossing points, proved ineffective against dispersed assaults. World War II revealed that prediction without adaptability invited failure. The river crossings also highlighted the importance of initiative at junior levels. Small unit leaders made crossing decisions independently when communication lagged. World War II increasingly relied on such decentralized action. Patton's leadership philosophy created conditions where initiative was encouraged and protected. Errors were tolerated if they occurred in pursuit of momentum. World War II command culture varied sharply in this regard. German commanders, constrained by rigid reporting requirements, struggled to respond with similar flexibility. World War II often punished such rigidity when facing fluid threats. The crossings reshaped operational geography. Areas previously considered rear zones became contested spaces overnight. World War II blurred spatial distinctions under rapid maneuver. German attempts to establish new defensive anchors relied increasingly on urban areas rather than natural obstacles. World War II urban combat imposed different costs and challenges. Patton's rapid movement complicated civilian evacuation and German administrative control. World War II civilian experiences were deeply intertwined with military tempo. The episode also influenced Allied strategic confidence. Success reinforced the belief that German forces could be kept off balance through relentless pressure. World War II strategy increasingly favored exploitation. German commanders later reflected that once initiative was lost, recovery proved impossible without fresh forces. World War II attrition limited such options. Patton's operations during this period were later cited in staff college curricula as examples of exploiting fleeting windows of advantage. World War II case studies emphasized timing as a decisive variable. The crossings also demonstrated how operational art bridged tactics and strategy. Actions taken at company and battalion level produced effects at army and theater level. World War II interconnected scales of warfare. German resistance continued in subsequent battles, but without the cohesion that had characterized earlier defenses. World War II often featured such gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. Patton's approach contrasted with more deliberate methods elsewhere along the front. Both contributed to victory, but in different ways. World War II accommodated multiple styles of command. The rivers themselves faded from operational planning as defensive anchors. Their failure as barriers altered German assumptions about future engagements. World War II repeatedly overturned such assumptions. Patton's ability to maintain pressure despite logistical strain reinforced his belief that audacity could compensate for material limitations, at least temporarily. World War II validated this belief under specific conditions. German officers acknowledged that Patton's tempo forced them into constant reaction, undermining any opportunity to seize initiative. World War II rewarded those who controlled tempo. The crossings also influenced post-war debates about risk management. Historians and officers debated whether Patton's success depended on circumstance or principle. World War II provided evidence for both interpretations. The event's lasting significance lies in its illustration of how speed, when applied at the right moment, could unravel defenses thought to be secure. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that stability was often illusory. As subsequent operations unfolded, the imprint of those 48 hours remained evident in German dispositions and Allied confidence. The rivers had been crossed, but the deeper boundary, the enemy's belief in control, had been irreversibly breached.